Yeah, they're close to Leningrad. It might be tough to surround. I mean, there's the big lake and the Gulf of Finland and all, so it wouldn't be airtight. All I'm saying is it might take a while. Okay. August 8th, 1941. Germany invaded the USSR in June, and the Soviets have struggled to organize and reorganize their high commands since then, even as they lost enormous amounts of men and land to the invaders. This week, their chain of command gets more concrete. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Japanese occupied French bases in Indochina, and the US and the Dutch responded by freezing Japanese assets. The US will also build up its forces on the Philippines as a deterrent to further aggressive Japanese behavior. The Germans were advancing in the USSR in the north and the south, and in the center, new orders came calling for the spearhead units to rest and refit, and Georgy Zhukov was replaced as Red Army Chief of Staff by Boris Shaposhnikov. There have been a bunch of changes in Soviet high command, actually. This week on the 8th, after what David Glantz describes as a bewildering series of changes in name and membership since it was first activated June 23rd as the Stavka of the main command, the Stavka of the Supreme High Command emerges, a war council with Joseph Stalin as Supreme High Commander. The Stavka, though, and the General Staff, and in fact, all government departments and things related to the war effort are subordinate to the GKO, the State Defense Committee, whose resolutions have the full strength of law. This was established back on June 30th. The GKO and the Politburo direct the Stavka, whose job is to evaluate strategic conditions, create units and groups of units, and coordinate operations, whether at the field army, front, or group of fronts level. It also directs the reserves and technical support. The Red Army General Staff is under the Stavka, and it is tasked with strategic direction of the conduct of the war. So, the General Staff and the various front commanders propose campaigns and strategies. The Stavka discusses them with party and state leaders and reaches its decisions campaigns and operations. The Stavka directly supervises the various fronts and the naval fleets. It also directs the partisan movement through the central headquarters of the partisan movement. In actual practice, however, the word Stavka is now loosely used to describe the General Staff, Supreme High Command, or Joseph Stalin. There is a separate Red Army Air Force command to deal with what's left of the Air Force. Now, I mentioned last week that General Pavlov, among others, was executed, right? For military incompetence. Political commissars by now again have co-equal status with military commanders, thanks to all the initial Red Army defeat. So there's a general air of suspicion. Many soldiers are going to prison, while many former soldiers are being released from prison to fight. Many soldiers who escaped from German encirclements returned to Soviet lines only to find themselves disarmed, arrested, and interrogated by NKVD rear security units looking for cowardice and sabotage. And the Germans have taken an awful lot of prisoners, and they get a load more this week. On the 5th, Fedor von Bock, commander of German Army Group Center, declares the encirclement at Smolensk over, and they have taken 309,110 prisoners. It was closed last week, but the Soviets managed to break a hole in the east on the 1st. It is sealed again. The large numbers of Red Army soldiers escape. The Soviets, for their part, continue strong attacks at the Yelnya salient, though the Germans take Roslavl III. Army Group Center, however, in spite of all its victories, has severe supply and manpower issues, but they are getting ready to settle into defense, according to Hitler's directive from last week, to give their two panzer groups times to refit and reorganize. That decision to stop heading east and pretty much stay in place was prompted by success. By the end of July, the German invaders were becoming aware of the true scope of their enterprise. The enormous success of their initial advance had caused them to outrun their fragile logistical structure. 2nd Panzer Group's embattled bridgehead over the Desna River at Yelnya was 720 kilometers from the nearest German railhead. Poor roads made it difficult for wheeled vehicles, let alone foot infantry, to keep pace with the tanks and the spearheads. The infantry was running short on boots, and staff officers began to plan for large quantities of winter clothing. We've seen how new Soviet armies and reserves are pouring in, but on the German side, by the end of July, they'd taken some 213,000 casualties, but had gotten just 47,000 replacements. But Hitler doesn't want to send in more stuff. He's reserving newly produced tanks and things like that for after the campaign season, for new and reconstituted panzer groups then. Back on July 14th, he even reduced the production priority of the army in the field. So this week on the 4th at Army Group Center, when Hitler visits, as I mentioned he would last week, his senior commanders plead with him just to get 350 engines for Mark III tanks. Not the tanks, just engines is tough for them to get. Well, Army Group Center starts implementing last week's directive, the 6th, after the Soviet 28th Army is destroyed in the encirclement. So this day, the infantry divisions of the German 2nd Army and 2 divisions from Heinz Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group attack southward across the Soj River towards Gomel. Thing is, Stavka is kind of ready for this, since back on the 23rd, it had formed a new central front made up of the 13th and 21st Armies. The German attack does force the 21st Army to the south, and even threatens to open a gap between the Soviet forces defending Kiev and those defending east of Smolensk. There is a lot going on around Kiev and in Ukraine, actually. Walter von Reichenau's forward units reach the outskirts of Kiev the 6th, but they are driven back by Andrei Vlasov's 37th Army at the end of the week. Ewald von Kleist has broken through the Soviet defenses and outflanked the Soviet 6th and 12th Armies from the north, as we saw, while the German 17th Army has also broken through in a 2-pronged advance, one to the north to meet up with Kleist, and one towards the Black Sea. And the German trap closes on the 2nd when Kleist's units link up with units of the 17th southeast of Uman. There is another smaller encirclement as well when the 16th Panzer Division meets Hungarian forces at Pervomaisk. Ivan Tulenev, in command of the Southern Front, does not realize that his armies are in 2 cauldrons. He thinks that it is only mobile German forces that stand between them and safety. The reality is that from the east, they're being attacked by 6 divisions from 2 motorized corps of the 1st Panzer Group and 2 infantry divisions, and from the west by elements of the 6th Army, the 17th Army, and mobile Hungarian units, so they are on their own. On both the 6th and the 7th, they try to break free, but to no avail. I mentioned last week that Stavka ordered the southwest and southern fronts to launch a combined attack, but with the south front in a cauldron, that ain't gonna happen. What does happen is that Potapov's 5th Army launches an attack on its own beginning the 4th. By the end of the week, it has ended with heavy Soviet casualties and not much to show for it. After that, the 5th begins to withdraw towards the safety of the Kiev defenses. There's a lot of action in the north this week as well. On the 2nd, the Germans begin to attack Staraya Russa south of Lake Ilmen on their drive to Leningrad. Ernst Busch's 16th Army captures Cholm. The Germans now have a continuous front from Lake Ilmen to Veliki Luki. But their advance was delayed for 3 weeks by Nikolai Vatutin's counterattack that I spoke of last week. So Army Group North, under Wilhelm von Leeb's command, advanced 450 kilometers in the first 2 weeks of the invasion, but then spent nearly a month to move another 120. They are still over 100 kilometers from Leningrad. On the 8th comes a determined assault on the River Luga line, outermost of Leningrad's defenses. The attack on Leningrad is to be coordinated with a Finnish-German attack across Karelia, formerly Finnish territory, and attacks extending northward past the Arctic Circle. Thing is, it's kind of hard to encircle Leningrad with Lake Ladoga behind it and the Gulf of Finland in front of it. And the city has had time to mobilize its inhabitants to build a serious system of concentric defense lines around it. 1,000 kilometers of earthworks, 650 kilometers of anti-tank ditches, 600 kilometers of barbed wire defense, and 5,000 pillboxes. This was all built by 200,000 civilians, equal numbers of men and women, and 300,000 members of the Young Communist League. Klim Voroshilov, in overall command of the Soviet Northwest Direction, a group of fronts, has used the time gained to beef up the Luga defenses. He was actually criticized by Stalin last week for his lack of toughness. To help Voroshilov out, now on the 6th and 7th, Stavka assigns the new 34th and 48th Armies to the Northwest Front, the first towards Staraya Russa and the second north of Lake Ilmen. At the end of the week on the 8th, Hitler orders Leib to surround Leningrad and link up with the Finns. Leib's main attack is to be between the river Narva and Lake Ilmen, with a secondary attack south of Lake Ilmen. This is actually the whole attack plan, courtesy of David Glantz. The northern group, which is the 31st Motorized and 38th Army Corps, will attack towards Kingisepp and Leningrad from the Luga bridgeheads. The southern group, which is the 1st and 28th Army Corps, will hit the Soviet 48th Army along the Shimsk-Novgorod-Khudovo line, surround the city from the east, and cut off its communications with Moscow. On the far left, the 18th Army is to move on Narva and then take Tallinn and the Estonian coast. On the far right, the 17th Army will beat the Soviets south of Lake Ilmen, take Staraya Russa and Veliki Luki, and cut the Moscow-Leningrad Railway east of the Valdai Hills. That's the plan anyhow, and plans may be subject to change, for on the 7th, at a meeting of OKH and OKW, High Command of the Army and High Command of the Armed Forces, Franz Halder and Alfred Jodl, the respective chiefs of staff, try to convince Hitler that they do need to resume the advance on Moscow. The Japanese this week resumed something too, the bombing of Chongqing in China. They have been conducting a terror bombing campaign there since February off and on. The last major attack being June 5th, which you'll have seen if you follow our Instagram day-by-day coverage of the war. The resumption of the campaign will last for the next few weeks. But Japanese aggression, not just in China, but in that whole part of the globe, has aroused the Allies. On the 6th, the Americans and the British warned Japan not to invade Thailand. That same day, the Japanese government makes proposals to the US. These involve concessions in China and Indochina in return for unfreezing Japanese assets in the States. The United States does not accept. The Japanese then propose that Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoye and American President Roosevelt meet up. The next day, Japan's Lord Privy Seal, Kido Koichi, warns Konoye that if they go to war with the Western powers, they will likely lose because they don't have the long-term resources for it. He also says this, stressing a point so obvious that others had overlooked it to Japan's vast disadvantage. If Japan seizes the Netherlands East Indies and got into a war with the United States, the oil from the wells in the Indies, after these had been repaired, would still have to be shipped to Japan, which would then be vulnerable to blockade by ships and submarines. This self-evident point that the conquest would not move the oil wells from Borneo or Sumatra to the Japanese home islands any more than it would move the rubber plantations or tin mines there, had apparently not occurred to anyone else in Tokyo. It was not about to hold them back now. And with that sobering analysis, I will end the week. A week of German gains on all of their eastern fronts, even as the Central Front then quiets down to play defense. There are changes in command structure and strategic direction, and more tension between Japan and the United States. There is one thing that's not changing direction, and that is what is going on in German-occupied territory. We know this because SS headquarters in Berlin receives reports daily of the executions. Martin Gilbert writes that on the 7th, the German police commander in the central sector, von den Bach-Zelewski, reported that his unit had carried out 30,000 executions since their arrival in Russia. The SS Cavalry Brigade also sent in a report to Berlin that day to say that it had carried out 7,819 executions to date in the Minsk area. Now, these are obviously secret reports. So you may be wondering how we know it's not just an exaggeration or a fabrication by someone. Well, since they are top secret reports, they are sent by the most secure cipher system Germany has available, Enigma, which has been cracked. So these reports are read by British intelligence. It is not a secret what is happening to civilians in the occupied territory. It is an unfolding horror story that is already increasingly coming to the attention of the outside world. To understand the details of that terror, we follow those events on our War Against Humanity series, and they are now coming out every second week. You can watch the most recent one right here. Our Time Ghost Army member of the week is Ilya Dolgov. It is thanks to the financial contributions of the Time Ghost Army that we are able to put all of these events into a new context of chronology to remember our past and learn from it. So join the army at patreon.com or timeghost.tv. See you next time.